Or, perhaps by identifying themselves with English culture, they hoped to forget their peasant origins. It is also possible that they felt the English, with their well-known tolerance of eccentrics, would be more accepting of their quirks and inconsistencies than the cruder and more conventional Americans. But all this lay in the future on a cold winter afternoon in 1930 when Sid Perelman and Will Johnstone were rushed across the street from the Hotel Astor to the New York office of Jesse Lasky, boss of Paramount Pictures. There they signed 6-week contracts at $500 a week and made travel arrangements to go to Hollywood. Getting to Hollywood proved almost as traumatic as work on the new Marx Brothers picture. Laura had broken her arm after falling on an icy sidewalk. Gurki, the Perelman schnauzer, couldn't be left behind, and, once aboard the 20th century, barked incessantly. According to Sid's later account, the dog was eventually banished to the baggage car, where he ululated for 3,000 miles and spread neurasthenia among the postal clerks. In Hollywood, Sid, Laura, and Gurki, German for cucumber, stayed first at a hotel, but soon moved to an inexpensive apartment in the Bungalow Court and then to the Garden of Allah on Sunset Boulevard, a favorite haunt of movie screenwriters. Both Perelmans were depressed by Hollywood. Hollywood Boulevard creates an instant and malign impression in the breast of the beholder, Sid later wrote. Viewed in full sunlight, its tawdriness is unspeakable. In the torrential downpour of the rainy season as we first saw it, it inspired an anguish similar to that produced by the engravings of Piranesi. After a few days I could have sworn that our faces began to take on the hue of Kodachromes, and even the dog, an animal used to bizarre surroundings, developed a strange, off-register look, as if he were badly printed in overlapping colors. Everyone in Hollywood went to bed at 10:30, he told Edmund Wilson, and there wasn't any place to go at night. Even restaurants, such as the Brown Derby, were empty after that hour, and he saw only a couple of people in them, among them Wilson Misner, owner of the restaurant. His mood was not lightened by his first sight of the Paramount studio, which reminded him of a factory, nor was he cheered by a meeting with Herman Mankiewicz, the caustic Teutonic producer of Monkey Business. Mankiewicz, a first-class wit and compulsive gambler, had long ago shed any illusions about the Marx Brothers. They're mercurial, devious, and ungrateful, he told Sid. I hate to depress you, but you'll rue the day you ever took the assignment. This is an ordeal by fire. Make sure you wear asbestos pants. Teet Carl, the former publicity director at Paramount, was then working as a unit publicist assigned to Monkey Business. He remembers meeting Sid shortly after Johnstone and Perelman arrived in Hollywood. Sid had shown Carl a copy of Don Ginsberg's Revenge. Not as a matter of ego, he said, but to show how he spelled his name. He pointed out Groucho's blurb on the dust jacket, telling Carl that Groucho's first submission had been, "This book will always be a first edition," which he said he thought was hilarious. If she said he thought hilarious. But Horace Liveright had rejected the line on the grounds that if the book went into other printings, a buyer might mistakenly assume he did own a first edition. I was struck by the difference between Perelman and Johnstone, Carl recalls. Sid was smaller, not so handsome. He wore heavy lensed glasses and was much younger. Johnstone had wavy white, or maybe blonde, hair and was perhaps 15 years older. He also was more reserved. Sid, Carl felt, was a likable person who was easy to know. He was able to cope with working for the Marxes even when the studio moved them, with their secretary Rachel Linden, into Perelman's and Johnstone's tiny two-room office, thereby forcing the two writers into tenement-like rooms that were directly above the office of some construction workers. Sid was intensely curious about the stars with whom Carl had worked, especially Clara Bow, Richard Dix, Willis Beery, and Chester Conklin. Carl's professional relationship with W.C. Fields fascinated him, and he loved the publicist's story about how Fields, who could be difficult to interview, suddenly loosened up and talked for 2 hours. As much intrigued by strange names as Perelman, Fields had done a double-take when Teet Carl told him his first name was actually Cecil, a name he detested. Fields then confided that in his boyhood his family had called him by his middle name, Claude, which he also hated. He much preferred to be called by his nickname, Whitey. Another person at Paramount who intrigued Perelman was the writer George Marion, Jr. At that time Marion was a very famous writer of titles for silent comedy features. He was so prolific that he was able to write titles for 3 films in 2 weeks. Sid kept Carl well supplied with stories about the Marx Brothers during the making of the picture, which Carl enlightened him about studio politics. One night Sid went to the fights at the Hollywood Legion with Groucho. Carl remembers, "He told me how, as a fighter named Danny danced out to start the opening round, Groucho yelled, 'Come on, Danny, give him a boxing lesson.' His opponent threw a punch, and even before Danny had hit the canvas, Groucho yelled, 'And take one yourself.' Then there was the time Sid told me how the Marx Brothers' father, often at the studio, asked Harpo, 'Can I borrow your ducks tonight?' Harpo said, 'My tux, you mean? What for?' The old man, whom we all liked, answered, 'I've got tickets to a previous.' Perelman and Johnstone managed to complete the script of Monkey Business in little more than 6 weeks. They had only the vaguest idea of what they were doing, but thought their script would sound professional if they put in a lot of technical terms. Wherever possible, they threw in words such as dolly, iris out, and for capage shot, a fast close-up that had been invented by the montage editor and film theorist at RKO and Paramount, Slavko for capage. As Sid later said, "We thought in our innocence that all these instructions would act as a guide to the director. We wrote about 125 pages in this fashion." In February of 1931, as soon as the Marxes had returned from their engagement at the Palace Theatre in London, they summoned Perelman and Johnstone to read the script to them in their suite at the Roosevelt Hotel. The writers, who were the first to arrive, flipped coins to determine which one of them would read the script. Perelman won. He later claimed that his only acting experience had been a minor role in a high school pageant based on the life of Pocahontas. At any rate, he was not an adept public speaker, and that night his nervousness was intensified by the perhaps deliberate tardiness of Groucho and his brothers. After a 45-minute wait, the audience started drifting in. First the Marx's father, then Herman Mankiewicz with his brother Joseph, then a Paramount scriptwriter, 3 of the Marxes and their wives, their lawyers, dentists, accountants, and several dogs, including Zeppo's Afghans, who had devoured the upholstery of his car that afternoon, and Chico's wire-haired terrier, which immediately started fighting with the Afghans. Finally, Groucho and his wife arrived. There were at least 27 people and 5 dogs in the room. As soon as they had all more or less settled themselves, Sid began reading the script, including all the technical terms. It took about an hour and a half. During the reading, Harpo, the dogs, and several people went to sleep. But Perelman went on reading, said Arthur Sheikman, Groucho's gag man. Valiantly, I thought. I would have shot myself on page 25. After Sid had finished reading, there was a deathly silence. Finally, Chico asked Groucho, "Well, what do you think?" Groucho took the cigar out of his mouth and said, "It stinks." Whereupon all the guests, including the dogs, got up and left the room. Fully convinced that he and Johnstone would be fired the next day, Sid was surprised to learn that the Marxists thought the script might work, if it was thoroughly overhauled. He and Johnstone spent the next 5 months rewriting it. They were joined by other Marx Brothers writers, Arthur Sheikman, Nat Perrin, J. Carver Pusey, and Solly Violinsky. The brothers also threw in suggestions, as did Herman Mankiewicz and Norman MacLeod, the director. One of Groucho's criticisms of Sid was that his humor was too literary and convoluted for a mass audience. It was during the making of Monkey Business that their lifelong battle began about whether screen comedy can ever afford to be intelligent or intellectual. Groucho particularly objected to a love scene between himself and Thelma Todd, in which Sid had written that Groucho was to jump up and say, "Come, Kapellmeister, let the violins throb, my regiment leaves at dawn." Then he was supposed to parody a famous scene from the popular film The Merry Widow, with Mae Murray. Groucho told Sid, "The problem is that the barber in Peru won't get it," meaning Peru, Indiana. Perelman tried to convince him that the scene would reveal Groucho's genius for parody, but he could not convince Groucho, and the Merry Widow scene was deleted. Sid's "Come, Kapellmeister" line remained in the picture, however, and he confessed that whenever he saw Monkey Business, he felt a sense of triumph when he heard Groucho say it.